In the heart of New York City, amid the clamor of factories, the smoke of tenements, and the restless footsteps of immigrants chasing the American dream, a new kind of power was quietly taking shape. The streets were alive with ambition, desperation, and violence, a tangled ecosystem where only the shrewdest survived. Into this world stepped a man who would not merely navigate its chow, she would redefine it. Salvatore Lucania, later known to the world as Lucky Luciano, was not born into greatness, he forged it with a combination of charm, cunning, and cold calculation. From the very first moment he crossed paths with New York's underworld, it became clear that he was no ordinary street kid. The city with its sprawling tenements and shadowed alleyways served as both his proving ground and his crucible, shaping a mind capable of orchestrating order in a world defined by chaos. Luciano's story is one of contrasts, brutality tempered with intelligence, ambition intertwined with pragmatism, loyalty shadowed by betrayal. He was a man who understood the delicate balance between fear and respect, the invisible lines of power that ran beneath the city's surface. Unlike the gangsters who came before him, who relied primarily on violence and intimidation, Luciano envisioned something larger, a structure, a hierarchy, a system where disputes could be mediated, profits maximized, and influence codified. He saw the Mafia not merely as a collection of street thugs or rival factions, but as an institution that could rival corporations in organization and reach. The era he entered was one of upheaval. Prohibition had transformed simple criminal enterprises into sprawling networks of money, liquor, and influence. Corruption seeped into politics and law enforcement, while rival gangs waged bloody wars over territory and profit. Amid this chaos, power was ephemeral, trust was fragile, and alliances could crumble in an instant. Yet amidst the bloodshed and betrayal, Luciano's mind moved like a chess master, calculating multiple moves ahead, observing weaknesses in his rivals and capitalizing on opportunities others could not even see. He was young yet possessed a strategic patience that belied his years, a combination of instinct and intellect that would set him apart from every contemporary mobster. But what truly distinguished Luciano was not just his ability to seize power, but the vision he carried for its exercise. He understood that to rule the underworld effectively, brute force alone was insufficient. He studied human nature, the subtle psychology of loyalty and fear, and the mechanics of influence. He recognized that a man could command obedience not merely through threats but through the promise of shared wealth, stability, and order. He could negotiate with rival factions, broker peace when necessary, and strike ruthlessly when opportunity demanded. In this way, Luciano transformed criminality into something more akin to enterprise, blending violence with diplomacy, intimidation with strategy. This story is not just about crimes or indictments, it is about the emergence of a mind capable of reshaping an entire criminal ecosystem. It is about the psychological landscape of power, the thrill of dominance, the paranoia of betrayal, and the intoxicating lure of control. It is about a man who learned early on that survival required more than fists. It required vision, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. As the city roared around him with police sirens, the clatter of factories, and the whispers of deals struck in smoke-filled back rooms, Luciano began a transformation that would alter the course of organized crime forever. Even now, decades later, the story of Lucky Luciano carries a magnetic pull. He is remembered as both a myth and a man, a symbol of ambition unrestrained by morality yet tempered by unparalleled strategic brilliance. His rise was not instantaneous, it was forged in the crucible of New York's underworld, amidst violence, poverty, and political corruption. But from those chaotic streets emerged a figure who could not only survive the brutal dynamics of the era but could reshape them, leaving a blueprint for organized crime that persists to this day. To witness Luciano's world is to witness the birth of modern organized crime, a world where power was not merely taken but crafted, where loyalty was a currency as valuable as money, and where one man's vision could unite factions, rewrite rules, and impose a new order on a city teetering on the edge of lawlessness. It is here, in the crowded streets and shadowed alleys of early 20th century New York, that the story of Lucky Luciano truly begins, a story of ambition, intelligence, violence, and the inexorable rise of a man who would make others bend, obey, and follow. The story of Lucky Luciano cannot be told without first understanding the world that shaped him. Born Salvatore Lucania in Lercara Fritti, a small Sicilian town riddled with poverty and shadowed by centuries of endemic crime, he came into the world amid scarcity, struggle, and survival instincts hardwired into daily life. His family, like so many Sicilian immigrants, sought a better future in America, carrying with them not just hopes and dreams but the hardened codes and values of the old country. From the outset, young Salvatore was thrust into a dual reality: the innocence of childhood against the harsh truths of survival, the warmth of family against the cold streets of a foreign land. These early years would plant the seeds of ambition, resilience, and cunning that would later define him as a man who could manipulate entire criminal empires. When the Lucanias arrived in New York City, they entered a metropolis overflowing with immigrants, each community trying to stake its claim in the chaos of a Booming industrial age. The Lower East Side, teeming with Italian family sweatshops and overcrowded tenements, was a world both alive and unforgiving for young Salvatore. Every street corner was a lesson in human behavior. Who commanded respect, who cowered, and who had the cunning to survive. Poverty was constant and opportunity was scarce, forcing children to develop instincts that blurred the line between survival and criminality. In the shadows of factories and in the alleys behind bustling markets, Luciano learned lessons that no school could teach: how to negotiate, how to intimidate, and how to observe human weakness as both a threat and a tool. From the very beginning it was clear that he was not like other children. While others played, he watched and calculated. While others obeyed, he tested limits. The streets were his classroom, the other street kids his competitors, and the lessons were brutal. Violence was not abstract, it was immediate. And personal fights over territory, petty thefts, and confrontations with rival youths sharpened his instincts. Yet alongside this raw instinctual education, Luciano displayed a sharp intelligence and ability to read situations and people with remarkable clarity. Where others reacted, he analyzed; where others fled, he strategized. These early patterns, merging instinct with intellect, would become the hallmark of his approach to power. Yet his early life was not solely defined by survival. There were moments of mentorship, exposure to older criminals, and subtle lessons in influence and negotiation. Older gangsters, recognizing his intelligence and audacity, began to take notice. Small tasks, running errands, delivering messages, collecting debts, taught him the mechanics of the criminal world while allowing him to observe hierarchy and loyalty firsthand. In these formative encounters he absorbed the unwritten rules of the streets: the price of betrayal, the currency of loyalty, and the subtle dance of fear and respect. Every handshake, every whispered warning, every clash with authority was a psychological lesson that would later inform his rise to dominance. Sicilian values, particularly the concept of honor and the code of omerta, were ingrained into him at a young age. These ideas were not merely cultural artifacts, they were survival mechanisms. Loyalty, secrecy, and discretion were as essential as any weapon. In New York, these values collided with the ruthless pragmatism of American criminality. Luciano learned to synthesize the two: the old world codes of honor, tempered by modern ambition and efficiency. This synthesis would later allow him to build alliances across factions, mediate disputes, and impose a level of organization that no one else in the American underworld had yet achieved. Education in the conventional sense was limited. Formal schooling was sporadic and often interrupted by the pressing needs of survival, but the education he received in the streets, in the tenements, and through observation was invaluable. He understood human nature in its rawest form: greed, fear, ambition, and envy. He saw how power could be wielded without lifting a fist, how a glance or a word could command obedience, and how patience could turn small victories into strategic advantages. Every observation, every minor confrontation, every moment of cunning was a brick in the foundation of a mind that would later control entire networks of crime. The psychological toll of these formative years cannot be understated. Witnessing constant poverty, violence, and the fragile nature of human relationships created a hardened, calculating outlook. Emotional resilience became as important as physical toughness. Luciano learned to mask vulnerability, to read intentions beneath facades, and to exploit weaknesses with precision. The lessons of fear, dominance, and survival were imprinted deeply. They would guide every decision he made in adulthood. In many ways his early experiences created a duality within him: a man capable of charm and charisma, yet equally capable of ruthless violence and manipulation. By the time he reached adolescence, Luciano had already begun to see patterns in the chaos around him. He understood that the fragmented gangs, the petty thieves, and the violent street bosses of New York's underworld were disorganized, inefficient, and vulnerable. To someone with vision, he saw opportunity not merely in theft or violence but in organization, strategy, and psychological manipulation. This realization would become the blueprint for his rise to harness the energy of the streets, unite factions under a common system, and impose a structure that allowed power to flow efficiently while fear and loyalty maintained control. The immigrant experience combined with the brutality of the streets forged Luciano into a man who could think several moves ahead, who could balance instinct with strategy, and who could merge old world values with new world ambition. These early years, defined by hardship, observation, and cunning, created the psychological scaffolding for a figure who would not simply participate in the criminal world but reshape it entirely. It was in this crucible of poverty, violence, and opportunity that the young Sicilian immigrant planted the seeds of a legacy that would echo across decades, a legacy that would transform organized crime into a structured, disciplined, and fearsome institution. By the time Salvatore Lucania entered his teenage years, the streets of New York had already begun to shape him into something far more dangerous than a common street thug. The Lower East Side, with its labyrinth of tenements, narrow alleys, and bustling markets, was alive with opportunity and peril. Teenage boys fought for scraps of territory, for protection, for recognition. In this unforgiving world, strength alone was never enough. Intelligence, cunning, and timing were just as critical for Luciano. Every fight, every chase, every confrontation was more than a test of muscle, it was a lesson in strategy, hierarchy, and psychological warfare. He quickly learned that survival demanded both boldness and subtlety. He had to assert himself without making enemies he could not control, and he had to pick battles with care. This delicate balance of aggression and calculation became second nature. Where other boys reacted with raw emotion, Luciano analyzed and adapted. Every punch thrown or dodge executed was accompanied by an evaluation. Who watched, who whispered, who could be turned into an ally or neutralized as a threat. These early instincts, honed on asphalt and behind tenement walls, laid the groundwork for a mind that would later dominate the criminal world with precision and foresight. The teenage Luciano was no stranger to violence, but he also understood the power of perception. A scuffle on the street was not merely a display of strength, it was an opportunity to establish reputation in a city where fear and respect were currency. A reputation could protect or destroy. Luciano cultivated both carefully. He learned to appear fearless even when unsure, to display courage while calculating risk. His early street fights were often as much about psychological dominance as physical victory, a subtle performance meant to communicate strength and command attention. By his mid-teens, word of the young Sicilian with sharp eyes and quicker reflexes had begun to circulate among local gangs. Yet the streets alone were not enough. Luciano also had mentors and older figures who recognized his potential. These were men who had survived decades of violence and knew the rules of survival. They provided him with knowledge that could not be gleaned from observation alone: how to negotiate debts, mediate disputes, and read loyalty in subtle gestures. They taught him that the most dangerous weapon was not always a knife or a gun, it was influence, and the ability to make others act on your behalf without ever issuing a direct command. Luciano absorbed these lessons like a sponge, combining them with his innate street instincts. Slowly he transitioned from mere participant in violence to orchestrator, someone who could manipulate situations to his advantage. At the same time, he began to test the boundaries of the law and social norms. Small-time thefts, pickpocketing, and other petty crimes were not only opportunities for profit, they were exercises in strategy, timing, and risk assessment. Luciano experimented with how far he could push authority, how to avoid detection, and how to use fear and respect as shields. Each minor offense was a rehearsal for larger moves, each close call a lesson in consequence and patience. The young Luciano was learning to wield crime as a tool, not merely as a means of survival. This period also revealed his early flair for networking and alliance building. In the chaotic streets, power was fragmented and loyalty was often fleeting. Luciano learned to identify who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who would betray at the slightest provocation. He began forging alliances with key figures in local gangs, understanding that influence came not only from strength but from the ability to coordinate and command loyalty. Even at this young age, he recognized that disorganized violence could only take one so far. Long-term success demanded structure, strategy, and the careful cultivation of relationships. Psychologically, these teenage years were critical. The constant exposure to danger, betrayal, and scarcity hardened his resolve while sharpening his instincts. He learned to mask vulnerability, read intentions behind facial expressions, and anticipate the moves of friend and foe alike. Fear became a tool he could observe in others, a signal of weakness to exploit or a warning to respect. Ambition grew alongside the understanding that survival alone was not enough. Dominance required vision, intelligence, and foresight. In many ways, this period was the forging of a mind capable of seeing several steps ahead, capable of orchestrating events that would later ripple across the entire underworld. Even his failures served as lessons. Not every confrontation ended in victory, and not every alliance was loyal, yet each setback was analyzed, each betrayal memorized and factored into his growing understanding of human nature. He internalized one crucial truth: in a world ruled by ambition, fear, and greed, strength alone could never guarantee survival, and violence without strategy could be fatal. By the end of his teenage years, Luciano had already developed a duality that would define him: a man capable of extraordinary charm and calculated persuasion, and equally capable of ruthless aggression when necessary. By the time he transitioned into adulthood, Luciano was more than a street kid. He was a strategist in embryonic form. He had mastered the delicate art of navigating chaos, leveraging alliances, and understanding human psychology in its rawest, most unfiltered form. These formative years of small-scale hustle, street fights, and calculated manipulations were in essence a rehearsal for the empire he would later build, a foundation of intellect, instinct, and ambition that would allow him to consolidate power in a fragmented and dangerous underworld. Ultimately, the teenage years of Lucky Luciano were not merely a prelude to his criminal career, they were its training ground. In the crucible of poverty, violence, and opportunity, he learned the lessons that no classroom could teach: the value of observation, the power of reputation, the subtle mechanics of influence, and the necessity of vision. In a world defined by chaos, the streets of New York had tested him, honed him, and prepared him for the extraordinary ascent that would soon follow. The boy who had once fought for survival would become a man who could command, manipulate, and ultimately reshape the very structure of organized crime in America. By the time Luciano entered his early 20s, the streets of New York were no longer just a proving ground, they had become a stage on which he would begin orchestrating his first moves toward real power. Survival had taught him instincts, observation had taught him patience, and early hustles had taught him cunning. Now it was time to transform raw potential into influence, to climb the ranks of an underworld fragmented by rivalries, violence, and ambition. This was a world in which loyalty was transactional, betrayal was omnipresent, and every alliance carried hidden risks. Navigating it required more than brute force, it demanded strategy, charisma, and the subtle psychology of persuasion. Luciano had learned well at this stage. Mentors and early allies played an increasingly pivotal role. Older gangsters, impressed by his intelligence, audacity, and composure, began to take him under their wing. These men, veterans of the streets and of organized crime, provided insights that went beyond mere survival. They demonstrated the mechanics of hierarchy, the importance of reputation, and the value of cultivating both fear and respect. Luciano absorbed these lessons with remarkable acuity, observing not just what worked but why it worked. He began to understand that power was never absolute, it was relational, dependent on perception, influence, and the careful management of both allies and enemies. Early on, he aligned himself with figures who were influential yet open to change, men who recognized that the chaotic violence of the era could be harnessed into a structured system. He quickly learned that raw aggression alone produced fleeting victories, while strategic alliances produced enduring control. These relationships were delicate, often requiring him to navigate egos, rivalries, and subtle slights with precision. A poorly timed word, an unguarded action, or a misread glance could undo years of carefully built influence. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to remain calm under pressure, to think several moves ahead, and to exploit opportunities that others overlooked. During this period, Luciano also began to refine his approach to intimidation and negotiation. He understood the subtle cues that revealed weakness, hesitation, nervous glances, overcompensation, or an unsteady tone. He leveraged these insights, often without resorting to violence, to manipulate rivals and secure advantages for those who resisted. The lesson was enforced swiftly and decisively. This combination of psychological insight, charisma, and ruthlessness became a hallmark of his style, allowing him to command loyalty while keeping potential threats in check. Every action, whether a handshake or a subtle threat, was calculated to increase his influence and strengthen his position within the intricate web of underworld alliances. Luciano's ascent was also fueled by his strategic understanding of opportunity. Prohibition had created vast, lucrative markets for bootlegging, gambling, and illicit entertainment. Unlike his contemporaries, who often competed destructively over small territories or short-term profits, Luciano envisioned broader networks. He sought control not merely over local operations but over the relationships that connected different factions, different trades, and different neighborhoods. By doing so, he could mediate disputes, coordinate activities, and extract value across a network rather than from isolated operations. This vision of organized crime as a structured enterprise distinguished him from other gangsters and foreshadowed his eventual creation of the Commission. However, power in the underworld is never granted freely. Rivalries and suspicion were constant. Many older mobsters viewed Luciano's ambition and strategic insight with a mixture of respect and wariness. He had to prove himself repeatedly, demonstrating not just courage but wisdom, foresight, and reliability. One misstep could trigger retaliation. One act of perceived betrayal could unravel months of careful diplomacy. Yet Luciano thrived under this pressure. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. Every challenge became a test of his ability to manipulate perception, manage fear, and consolidate influence. In navigating these complex dynamics, he honed a skill that would define his reign: the ability to control situations indirectly, bending people and circumstances to his will without always exposing himself to immediate danger. During this stage, alliances were as much about long-term positioning as immediate gain. Luciano understood that today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy and vice versa. He developed a nuanced approach, maintaining loyalty while planting seeds of dependence, offering protection while subtly enforcing obligation, and balancing charm with intimidation. Through these relationships, he began to build a reputation not just as a street fighter but as a strategist and negotiator, someone capable of shaping outcomes beyond his immediate reach. These alliances laid the foundation for the network he would eventually formalize into a hierarchy capable of sustaining power across factions and territories. Luciano also recognized the importance of image and perception in consolidating authority. A gangster who appeared impulsive, irrational, or reckless invited challenges. A man who projected calm confidence and control commanded attention. He cultivated a presence that combined approachability with latent threat, charm with subtle menace. This duality allowed him to move fluidly between the worlds of negotiation and enforcement, of diplomacy and violence. Associates were drawn to him, rivals hesitated before confronting him, and even law enforcement began to notice the emerging figure who seemed always one step ahead. It was during this period that Luciano's capacity for foresight became most evident. He observed the limitations of older leadership models in the Mafia, which relied on outdated codes and personal loyalty rather than systematic strategy. He began to envision a system in which disputes could be mediated, profits could be maximized, and power could be exercised without constant violent confrontation. This vision was revolutionary. While other gangsters focused on territory, revenge, or short-term gain, Luciano was thinking in terms of networks, hierarchy, and institutionalized control. It was the first inkling of a blueprint that would later formalize the Commission, the governing body of organized crime in America. Yet ambition alone was never enough. Luciano's rise required patience and timing. He waited for openings, observed weaknesses, and struck only when advantage was guaranteed. Impulsiveness could destroy months of strategy. Patience allowed him to consolidate power quietly, efficiently, and without drawing unnecessary attention. This disciplined approach distinguished him from contemporaries who relied on brute force or impulsive retaliation. Luciano's genius was in his ability to transform violence into strategy, observation into influence, and ambition into institutional power. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had begun to emerge as more than a streetwise opportunist. He was a rising strategist, a negotiator, and a broker of influence. A man whose intelligence, discipline, and psychological insight allowed him to navigate the treacherous terrain of New York's underworld with unprecedented skill. He had built a foundation of alliances, mastered the subtle mechanics of intimidation, and begun to envision a structure that could transform chaotic crime into organized enterprise. The young Sicilian immigrant who once fought for survival on street corners was now positioning himself to become a master of power, capable of orchestrating events that would reshape the underworld for decades to come. In this way, the story of Luciano's early climb is not merely a tale of ambition. It is a study in psychology, strategy, and the transformation of raw potential into influence. It is a portrait of a man who understood that control is never granted, only seized and maintained, and that power in its purest form requires patience, perception, and an unwavering understanding of human nature. These were the lessons that would guide him through the violent, chaotic, and high-stakes world of organized crime, setting the stage for the empire he was about to construct. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had transitioned from a rising street figure to a man with a vision. The transformation of criminal chaos into a disciplined, profitable enterprise. Prohibition had created a vast, unprecedented opportunity. The flow of illegal alcohol through New York and across the country was enormous, and the potential for profit was staggering. Yet most gangs approached it with a scattershot mentality, fighting over territory or indulging in short-term gains. Luciano, however, saw beyond immediate profits. He recognized that to survive and to thrive, he needed to create a system, a network that could coordinate operations, mediate disputes, and maximize efficiency. This was not merely crime, it was business. Luciano approached his criminal endeavors with the mind of an entrepreneur, combining ambition, strategic thinking, and psychological insight. He understood that control was not won through violence alone. It required structure, accountability, and foresight. Bootlegging operations were expanded not just in quantity but in organization. Smugglers, distributors, and local operatives were integrated into a coordinated network. Money flowed efficiently, territories were delineated, and disputes were arbitrated before they could erupt into costly wars. Every element of the operation was designed to reduce risk and increase profit, reflecting a mindset that saw opportunity where others saw danger. Beyond alcohol, Luciano recognized the potential of gambling as a source of steady income and influence. Numbers games, underground casinos, and betting rings were not merely revenue streams, they were instruments of control. By managing these enterprises, he could wield influence over local politicians, law enforcement, and the communities where these operations flourished. He combined charm, intimidation, and subtle bribery to secure cooperation while minimizing exposure. In Luciano's hands, gambling became more than a pastime. It became a tool for power and expansion, a means to consolidate influence across multiple layers of society. Labor unions and legitimate businesses were another frontier Luciano exploited with remarkable acuity. He understood that control over unions, docks, and shipping operations could provide leverage over the city's economy and political landscape. By infiltrating unions, he could dictate employment, direct shipments, and control industries critical to the flow of goods. These maneuvers were carefully calculated. They expanded his empire without drawing the attention that outright criminal acts often provoked. It was a delicate balance of power and discretion, an exercise in influence that required patience, strategic alliances, and a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Psychologically, Luciano's approach to the business of crime was revolutionary. He did not rely solely on brute force to maintain control. He relied on perception, trust, and fear in equal measure. Associates knew that loyalty was rewarded but betrayal would be punished without hesitation. Rivals were observed for weakness and opportunity. Law enforcement was engaged with a combination of bribery, negotiation, and misdirection. In every interaction, Luciano demonstrated a mastery of human nature. he understood what motivated people, how to manipulate desire and how to exploit fear. This blend of intelligence and ruthlessness allowed him to maintain dominance while keeping violence strategically targeted rather than indiscriminate. One of Luciano's most striking innovations was his ability to mediate disputes among rival gangs. The New York underworld had long been fragmented with endless feuds costing lives and profits. Luciano understood that ongoing conflict threatened his vision of an organized empire. He positioned himself as a negotiator and arbitrator, someone who could impose rules and establish order. These interventions were not acts of altruism, they were calculated moves to consolidate his influence, reduce competition, and ensure stability for his operations. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for a system of governance that would later become the Commission. The combination of enterprise negotiation and psychological insight set Luciano apart from his peers. Where other mobsters relied on intimidation or impulsive violence, he relied on strategy, systems, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. He recognized that true power was exercised not only through fear but through control over networks, information, and resources. Every bootlegging route, every gambling operation, every union influence was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that when assembled allowed him to command vast operations with precision and foresight. Despite the appearance of calm and control, the stakes were immense. Operating in a world of violence, corruption, and constant competition meant that every decision carried potential danger. A poorly timed move, a misread signal, or a betrayal by a trusted associate could unravel years of careful planning. Luciano's genius was in his ability to anticipate these risks, plan contingencies, and execute operations with minimal exposure. He transformed chaos into opportunity, unpredictability into advantage, and threat into leverage. In doing so, he elevated crime from the realm of the impulsive and chaotic to that of calculated enterprise. During this period, Luciano's personal psychology became deeply intertwined with his empire. He relished the challenge of complexity, the thrill of strategic maneuvers, and the subtle power of influence, yet he was also constantly aware of the fragility of his position. He had seen rivals rise and fall, friends betray, and empires crumble under violence or mismanagement. This awareness kept him vigilant, adaptable, and constantly calculating. Every conversation, every gesture, every alliance was observed through a lens of long-term strategy. The man who once fought for survival on street corners now orchestrated operations that spanned neighborhoods, industries, and social strata. By the early 1930s, Luciano's empire was not only financially profitable but structurally sophisticated. He had created networks that could endure leadership changes, conflicts, and law enforcement pressure. He had systematized what had previously been anarchic, channeling ambition and aggression into coordinated operations that benefited both him and his allies. The success of these enterprises solidified his reputation as a visionary strategist, a man whose intellect and foresight matched, if not exceeded, his willingness to employ violence when necessary. Yet the business of crime was never purely transactional for Luciano. It was deeply psychological. He understood that human behavior could be influenced as much by perception, fear, and desire as by money. Associates were motivated not just by profit but by loyalty, reputation, and the implicit understanding that alignment with him ensured survival and success. Rivals were destabilized by the perception of his omnipresent influence. Law enforcement was manipulated through calculated bribery, diversion, and negotiation. In every layer of his operations, Luciano demonstrated a nuanced grasp of psychology, positioning himself as both feared and respected. This period also foreshadowed one of his most enduring legacies, the idea that organized crime could be rationalized, structured, and institutionalized by turning violence into strategy, competition into coordination, and ambition into system. Luciano was not merely accumulating wealth, was creating a framework that would define organized crime in America for decades. Bootlegging, gambling, union influence, and strategic alliances were all threads woven into a larger tapestry of control, one that would later formalize into the governance of the Commission. By the end of this era, Luciano had achieved something remarkable. He had taken the chaotic energy of New York's criminal underworld and transformed it into an organized, efficient, and sustainable empire. He had demonstrated a mastery of enterprise psychology and strategy rarely seen in the annals of crime. The streets that had once tested him, challenged him, and shaped him had now become a proving ground for a man who was no longer merely surviving but thriving, controlling and innovating. He had shown that crime, when guided by vision and intellect, could become an enduring institution rather than fleeting chaos. Luciano's success during this period was not merely about money or territory, it was about influence, perception, and the strategic manipulation of human behavior. He had created a system in which loyalty, fear, and opportunity were balanced, in which disputes could be managed, and in which power could be exercised with calculated precision. By the time he reached the height of his early empire, he was no longer just a participant in the criminal underworld, he was its architect, a man whose vision would forever alter the landscape of organized crime in America. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had established himself as a formidable figure in New York's underworld, but power in the Mafia was never absolute and influence was constantly contested. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, alliances shifted like sand, and betrayal lurked around every corner in this world. Loyalty was transactional, and the slightest misstep could trigger deadly consequences. Luciano had learned from his early experiences that survival required more than strength or cunning. It required understanding the delicate interplay of fear, respect, and strategy, and nowhere was this more evident than in his dealings with rival mobsters whose ambitions were as sharp and ruthless as his own. The landscape of organized crime at this time was fragmented and volatile. Traditional bosses clung to outdated codes of honor. Territorial control was fiercely contested, and generational rivalries ran deep. Luciano's rise threatened entrenched power structures, and many older mobsters viewed him as both audacious and dangerous. He was young, ambitious, and unencumbered by the limitations of tradition, willing to innovate where others clung to brute force. This combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and vision made him both respected and feared, but also marked him as a target for those unwilling to accept change. Alliances, therefore, were never simple. Luciano understood that a handshake or a truce was only as strong as the perception of mutual benefit. He cultivated relationships carefully, offering loyalty, protection, or profit where it served his larger strategy, while always keeping contingencies in place for potential betrayal. Some rivals became allies, recognizing that cooperation under Luciano's guidance could increase profits and reduce the destructive chaos that had historically plagued the underworld. Others remained antagonists, testing his resolve, probing for weakness, or seeking opportunities to destabilize his growing influence. Each interaction was a psychological chess match with stakes measured in both power and survival. Betrayal was an ever-present danger, and Luciano had already witnessed its consequences. The streets of New York had shown him that a single misstep, an unguarded word, a misread loyalty, or misplaced trust could result in death or the collapse of an operation. Yet he also learned to leverage betrayal as a tool, using deception and manipulation to turn rivals against one another, neutralizing threats before they could escalate. The psychology of fear and loyalty became central to his strategy, instilling respect without creating unnecessary enemies, rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty with precision. In this way, Luciano transformed what might have been chaos into controlled dynamics, maintaining supremacy while minimizing unnecessary exposure. During this period, a number of notable rivalries defined his rise. Established bosses steeped in the traditions of old-world crime often underestimated the young Sicilian, dismissing him as reckless or brash. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to anticipate their moves, manipulate circumstances, and exploit weaknesses that others overlooked. In some cases, he formed temporary alliances to neutralize threats. In others, he struck decisively, using calculated violence to assert dominance and reshape the power balance. Every action sent a message. Luciano was not merely ambitious, he was methodical, intelligent, and unafraid to wield both charm and force to achieve his aims. Yet his approach to conflict was never impulsive. Unlike his contemporaries who often relied on spontaneous violence, Luciano approached rivalry strategically. He identified patterns, observed human behavior, and waited for the precise moment to act. This calculated patience allowed him to consolidate influence without provoking unnecessary wars, avoiding the costly bloodshed that had historically weakened gangs and empires alike. In this sense, his psychology was as critical as his power. He understood that perception and timing were as vital as force in maintaining authority. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's rise was his ability to turn enemies into instruments of opportunity. Rivalries could be leveraged, resentments manipulated, and conflicts redirected to serve his broader objectives. He understood that fear could be balanced with incentive, that respect could be cultivated through both reward and intimidation. This nuanced approach distinguished him from other mobsters who relied on brute strength or impulsive retaliation. Luciano's genius was in his ability to transform potential threats into tools of consolidation, turning rivalry into a calculated advantage rather than a destabilizing force. Betrayal, of course, remained a constant shadow. Even allies could become adversaries, motivated by greed, envy, or self-preservation. Luciano's survival depended on a relentless awareness of these dynamics. He monitored behavior closely, interpreted subtle cues, and maintained multiple contingency plans. Every conversation, every meeting, every negotiation was filtered through a lens of caution and calculation. Yet he also knew when to show trust, to cultivate loyalty, and to reward those who aligned with his vision. This balance between fear and incentive created a network of influence that extended beyond simple transactions, embedding psychological control into the very fabric of his operations. The consequences of these rivalries were not abstract. Violence erupted when miscalculations occurred, and the Underworld was littered with the corpses of those who underestimated him or attempted betrayal, yet even in violence Luciano's strategy was evident. It was always precise, targeted, and intended to maximize long-term benefit while minimizing unnecessary exposure. He understood that chaos could be harnessed, that fear could be directed, and that reputation could be as powerful as any weapon. Each act of calculated violence reinforced his authority, demonstrating that while he could be ruthless, he was never reckless. By carefully navigating alliances, rivalries, and betrayals, Luciano began to consolidate power in a way that no one else in New York had achieved. His influence extended across territories, trades, and social strata. He created a balance of power that allowed him to operate with relative stability even in a world defined by volatility. This control was not absolute, but it was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication, reflecting a combination of psychological insight, strategic planning, and fearless ambition. In retrospect, this period was pivotal. It was the crucible in which Luciano honed the skills that would define his legacy: the ability to negotiate, manipulate, and control, the capacity to balance fear with respect, and the talent to transform rivalries into structured hierarchies of influence. The psychological acuity he displayed in navigating betrayal, competition, and shifting alliances became the foundation for the creation of the Commission, the governing body that would institutionalize the Mafia and redefine organized crime in America. Ultimately, these years of rivalry and betrayal were not simply obstacles, they were the training ground for a man who would not only survive the treacherous world of organized crime but dominate it. By understanding the psychology of fear, the mechanics of loyalty, and the subtle art of manipulation, Luciano demonstrated that power was not merely taken, it was cultivated, maintained, and strategically expanded. These lessons would guide him through the violent, unstable, and high-stakes environment of New York's underworld, preparing him to become the architect of an empire that would endure far beyond his own lifetime. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had reached a turning point. He had built influence, consolidated alliances, and mastered the art of balancing fear and loyalty, but the underworld remained fragmented and volatile. Violence between factions was routine, disputes over territory erupted with deadly regularity, and the chaotic system of power left enormous opportunities and enormous risks unrealized. Luciano recognized that the future of organized crime could not be secured through brute force alone. To survive, to prosper, and to shape a lasting empire, he would need to institutionalize power, creating rules, structures, and a system of governance that extended beyond the whims of individual bosses. It was here that the idea of the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, was born. The conception of the Commission was revolutionary. Luciano envisioned a council of leaders representing the major crime families who could mediate disputes, regulate competition, and coordinate operations across the country. No longer would personal vendettas dictate the flow of power. No longer would turf wars weaken the collective strength of organized crime. By introducing a system of governance, Luciano was not simply seeking to consolidate his own influence, he was redefining the very mechanics of power in the underworld. Authority in this model was exercised through negotiation, consensus, and strategic oversight rather than purely through violence or intimidation. The birth of the Commission required careful diplomacy and psychological insight. Many established bosses were wary, resistant to change, or protective of their traditional privileges. Convincing them to participate demanded more than promises. It required trust, demonstration of capability, and subtle psychological maneuvering. Luciano used a combination of respect, persuasion, and quiet intimidation to align interests. He made clear that the Commission was not merely a tool of control for one man, it was a structure designed to protect and expand the influence of all participating families. By framing collaboration as mutually beneficial, he was able to unite factions that had long been at war, turning potential enemies into stakeholders in a larger system. The Commission also allowed Luciano to impose order while remaining nimble. He could coordinate operations across territories, ensure that profits were maximized, and mediate disputes before they erupted into violent confrontations. This institutionalization of power was a profound psychological shift in the underworld. It reframed violence as a strategic tool rather than a default mode of operation, and it reframed loyalty as something that could be formalized, monitored, and incentivized. In essence, Luciano was transforming chaos into controlled enterprise, turning an anarchic environment into a predictable system in which influence could be measured, maintained, and expanded. Creating the Commission required navigating delicate egos and rivalries. Each family boss had to feel respected, autonomous, and secure in their position, even while agreeing to abide by a larger system. Luciano leveraged his understanding of human behavior to achieve this balance. He knew when to offer concessions, when to assert authority, and when to subtly intimidate. He cultivated an image of fairness, strategic acumen, and psychological insight that made leaders willing to follow him, or at least willing to acknowledge the benefits of collaboration. In doing so, he created not only a functional governing body but a psychological framework in which the Mafia could operate with reduced conflict and increased efficiency. The creation of the Commission also formalized Luciano's vision of organized crime as an enterprise. It was no longer a collection of disconnected gangs competing violently for territory and profit. It was a coordinated system in which rules were enforced, disputes were mediated, and strategic priorities were aligned. This structure allowed for the distribution of risk, the optimization of profit, and the mitigation of chaos. By introducing governance into an inherently lawless world, Luciano transformed the dynamics of power. Influence was no longer purely a function of personal charisma, brute force, or opportunistic violence. It became a function of strategic positioning, negotiation, and adherence to an agreed-upon framework. Psychologically, the Commission enhanced Luciano's control while reducing exposure. He no longer needed to be omnipresent in every conflict or operation. The structure allowed him to exert influence indirectly through rules, oversight, and the alignment of interests. This was a masterstroke of both strategy and human psychology. By creating a system that other leaders relied upon, he embedded his influence into the mechanics of the organization itself. Those who respected the system, whether out of self-interest, fear, or loyalty, were effectively bound to his vision. Without the need for constant enforcement, Luciano had achieved what few leaders in any domain ever achieved: power that extended beyond direct action, a web of influence that could operate independently while remaining aligned with his objectives. The establishment of the Commission also marked a profound shift in the culture of organized crime. The old world of impulsive violence, personal revenge, and unpredictable retaliation was giving way to a system governed by strategy, negotiation, and institutional oversight. This was a psychological evolution as much as an organizational one. The Mafia was learning to think in terms of networks, risk management, and long-term stability rather than immediate gratification. Luciano, in effect, was teaching a generation of criminals to think like executives rather than street fighters, to value structure as much as muscle, and to respect rules not out of morality but out of pragmatism. The creation of the Commission did not eliminate conflict, it managed it. Disputes still arose, rivalries flared, and tensions simmered, but they were now channeled through a formalized system in which negotiation, mediation, and strategy became primary tools. Violence was reserved for calculated interventions rather than chaotic reprisals. This strategic shift allowed the Mafia to expand its operations nationally, to coordinate cross-family ventures, and to maintain a level of stability unprecedented in the history of organized crime. Luciano's vision had created not just an empire but a durable framework capable of surviving internal and external pressures. Luciano's role in the Commission was both overt and subtle. He was a central architect guiding its formation and enforcing compliance, but he was also a strategist who understood the importance of indirect influence. By embedding himself within the system while allowing other leaders to exercise authority, he created a structure in which loyalty, fear, and cooperation were balanced. This careful orchestration allowed him to expand his reach without appearing overtly domineering, ensuring that the power he wielded was both sustainable and psychologically reinforced. The psychological genius of the Commission lay in its subtlety. By formalizing rules, mediating disputes, and structuring operations, Luciano created a system that commanded obedience without constant supervision. Leaders were bound not by fear alone but by self-interest, mutual benefit, and recognition of the advantages the system provided. The underworld, once defined by chaotic violence, had been transformed into a network of coordinated influence, and Luciano stood at the center of it, not merely as a participant but as its architect, strategist, and invisible hand. In retrospect, the creation of the Commission represents one of Luciano's most enduring legacies. It was a masterclass in power strategy and psychology, the transformation of raw ambition into structured influence, the conversion of chaos into controlled enterprise, and the institutionalization of human behavior in a system designed to endure. Luciano had not merely climbed the ranks or consolidated personal power, he had changed the rules of the game entirely, ensuring that organized crime in America would operate with a sophistication, efficiency, and resilience previously unimaginable. Through the Commission, Luciano cemented his vision, a world in which organized crime was no longer purely violent, unpredictable, and fragmented but structured, strategic, and enduring. The underworld had been reshaped by a man who understood psychology as deeply as power, who saw opportunity where others saw risk, and who had the ambition, intellect, and ruthlessness to translate vision into reality. The birth of the Commission marked not only the height of Luciano's influence but the beginning of a new era in American organized crime, system that would endure long after his personal reign, leaving an indelible mark on history. By the time Lucky Luciano had constructed the foundations of his criminal empire, his life was no longer defined solely by territory, money, or power. The public and private spheres of his existence had begun to intersect in ways that were both intoxicating and dangerous. Luciano was not only a strategist and a master of influence, he was a man acutely aware of image, desire, and perception. In a world where reputation was currency and visibility could be as lethal as a bullet, he carefully managed both. The allure and the menace he projected, love, lust and charisma, became tools of influence subtly intertwined with the business of crime, and they added layers of complexity to his psychological profile. Luciano's personal relationships were never simple. Women in his life were drawn to him by a mixture of charm, danger, and the intoxicating aura of power he exuded. For Luciano, romantic entanglements were never purely emotional. They were entangled with strategy, loyalty, and influence. He understood the delicate balance between attraction and control, between intimacy and leverage. In some cases, relationships served to solidify alliances, curry favor, or provide intelligence. In others, they satisfied personal desire, but underlying every connection was a keen awareness of the risks and rewards inherent in human attachment. In his world, passion was rarely innocent. It was a currency to be managed with the same care as territory or profit. Charisma was central to his influence. Luciano possessed an ability to charm and persuade that few could resist. He could disarm rivals with a smile, negotiate with subtlety, and cultivate loyalty through personal connection. This charisma extended beyond the intimate. It influenced business partners, political figures, and even law enforcement officials. He understood that power was not only enforced through violence or intimidation, but also through the careful cultivation of perception, to be feared yet admired, respected yet desired. This duality amplified his ability to operate effectively across multiple spheres of influence. Yet with desire came danger. Romantic and social connections could expose vulnerability, reveal secrets, or incite jealousy among allies and rivals alike. Luciano had learned, often brutally, that intimacy could be weaponized against him, whether through betrayal, blackmail, or emotional manipulation. His psychological acuity allowed him to navigate these hazards, but it did not eliminate them. The same charm that attracted allies and lovers also made him a target for those who sought to undermine his authority. In this sense, love and lust were both tools and threats, volatile forces that required careful management to ensure they reinforced rather than weakened his power. The public image of Lucky Luciano was also a critical component of his strategy. He was acutely aware that myth-making could serve as both shield and weapon. Stories of his audacity, charisma, and ruthlessness circulated widely, shaping perceptions of him as a man who commanded obedience and respect. These perceptions were carefully curated, amplified by selective appearances, media manipulation, and the orchestration of events that reinforced his reputation. In a world where fear and admiration were intertwined, Luciano understood that controlling the narrative could extend influence far beyond direct action. Reputation was not just symbolic, it was a psychological instrument that shaped behavior, loyalty, and caution among associates and rivals alike. Sexuality and relationships were also closely linked to power dynamics. Women were often positioned within networks of influence, either as connectors, informants, or symbols of status. Luciano understood that the personal and the political were intertwined. Every relationship carried implications for alliances, negotiations, and perception. The careful orchestration of desire and presence allowed him to navigate complex social landscapes, turning intimacy into leverage and attraction into subtle control. This was not mere manipulation, it was a sophisticated understanding of human psychology where emotions were intertwined with ambition, loyalty, and influence. Yet beneath the charm and allure lay a psychological pragmatism. Luciano's relationships were navigated with the same strategic calculation that guided his criminal enterprises. He weighed risks and rewards, assessed loyalty and motive, and anticipated the consequences of attachment or betrayal. Even in moments of apparent vulnerability, romantic gestures, confidences, or displays of affection, maintained an awareness of the broader context. Every interaction was evaluated for potential leverage, exposure, or reinforcement of status. This capacity to integrate personal and strategic awareness exemplified the psychological complexity that made him exceptional as a criminal architect and as a human being navigating a dangerous world. The intersection of desire and reputation also amplified his influence. Women, allies, and even rivals were all attuned to the aura of power Luciano projected, consciously or unconsciously reinforcing his authority. In social settings, he was both admired and feared. In intimate spaces, he was desired yet elusive. This duality enhanced his control, allowing him to operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously: the personal, the social, and the strategic. Each layer reinforced the others, creating a web of psychological dominance that extended far beyond physical presence or immediate action. At the same time, this period of his life revealed the psychological toll of constant performance. Maintaining charisma, managing relationships, and balancing desire with strategy required vigilance and emotional discipline. Trust was always conditional, loyalty always negotiated, and attachment always vulnerable to exploitation. The pleasures of personal relationships were inseparable from the burdens of calculation and control. Luciano lived in a constant state of psychological alertness, aware that personal missteps could have far-reaching consequences in a world defined by perception, fear, and ambition. Ultimately, this intertwining of love, lust, and public image reinforced Luciano's ability to maintain and expand influence. It was a form of psychological sophistication as vital as strategic planning or operational control. He understood that human behavior, desire, admiration, envy, and fear could be shaped, leveraged, and integrated into the machinery of power. Relationships were never purely personal, they were elements of an intricate system of control, perception, and influence. By mastering these dynamics, Luciano extended his reach, stabilized his position, and enhanced the durability of his empire. In retrospect, the orchestration of desire and image reveals another dimension of Luciano's genius. He was not only a strategist of crime and power but also a psychologist of influence, capable of integrating personal relationships, social perception, and strategic foresight into a coherent system. Love and lust were not distractions, they were instruments of power, subtle extensions of the mechanisms he had already used to consolidate and maintain dominance. In managing them, he demonstrated a level of sophistication that few leaders, criminal or otherwise, could match. A rare combination of charm, ruthlessness, and psychological insight that amplified every other aspect of his authority. By the end of this era, Luciano had transformed not only the streets of New York but also the very concept of power within them. He had shown that influence could extend beyond force, that charisma could reinforce control, and that desire and reputation could be harnessed as strategic instruments. The world of organized crime had become both more efficient and more psychologically complex, a reflection of the mind that shaped it. In balancing love, lust, and public image with ambition and ruthlessness, Luciano had created a multidimensional form of authority, a power that was as subtle as it was formidable, as psychological as it was practical, and as enduring as it was adaptable. Even the most carefully constructed empires carry the seeds of their own vulnerability. For lucky Luciano, the 1930s had been a period of unparalleled ascendancy. He had transformed chaos into structure, rivalry into collaboration, and ambition into a system that could endure. Yet in a world where power is inseparable from exposure, every advantage carries risk, and every alliance has its shadows. By the late 1930s, the foundations of his empire, brilliantly built as they were, faced pressures both external and internal. The fall of a king is rarely sudden, it begins subtly, often in whispers, missteps, and the slow tightening of circumstances beyond one's control. For Luciano, that fall would begin not with a single act of betrayal but through a convergence of law enforcement scrutiny, rival resentment, and the fragile nature of trust in the underworld. The first cracks appeared in the form of increased attention from law enforcement. Prohibition had ended, and with it the era of unchecked, highly profitable bootlegging. Yet the legacy of those operations, coupled with Luciano's rise, made him a visible and irresistible target for federal authorities. Bureaucracies, detectives, and investigators began to map the intricate web of alliances, territories, and operations that he had constructed. Every phone call intercepted, every witness coerced, and every informant recruited threatened to unravel the system he had built with such meticulous care. In these early warning signs, Luciano recognized the subtle mounting danger. The empire he had assembled could be dismantled not just by violence but by law, surveillance, and exposure. Rivalries also began to intensify despite the success of the commission and the apparent stability of his alliances. Old grudges and latent jealousy never fully dissipate. Leaders who had benefited from his vision occasionally bristled at the authority he wielded, subtly challenging decisions or testing his control. Some sought to exploit law enforcement attention while others maneuvered quietly to claim portions of his influence. Luciano's genius had always been in anticipating these moves, yet the complexity of an empire so vast meant that even the most careful strategies could be undermined by a single miscalculation, a single act of opportunistic betrayal. The delicate balance between fear, respect, and loyalty was under stress, and the first tremors of instability were becoming palpable. The psychological tension of this period was immense. Luciano, a man who had thrived on strategy, calculation, and observation, now faced forces that he could not entirely control. Law enforcement moved in ways that were unpredictable. Rival actors exploited subtle openings. Even allies occasionally wavered in loyalty. The very skills that had made him so formidable, the ability to manipulate perception, anticipate behavior, and orchestrate complex networks, were being tested against forces that did not always respond predictably. It was a reminder that no system, no matter how well constructed, is immune to disruption, and that even the most brilliant architect can be forced into reactive strategies. Internal pressures were compounded by the sheer scale of his operations. Maintaining influence over multiple families, territories, and enterprises required constant attention, subtle negotiation, and relentless oversight. Small errors, minor miscommunications, or moments of overconfidence could cascade into larger problems. The complexity that had allowed him to dominate the underworld now created vulnerability. Rivalries, betrayals, and law enforcement scrutiny converged in a way that began to strain the very foundations of the empire he had spent a decade constructing. This period illustrates a harsh truth of power: the larger the empire, the greater the fragility, and the more a single misstep can ripple through an entire system. The fall began with incidents that seemed minor at the time but which would later be recognized as pivotal. Associates were arrested, operations were disrupted, and Sensitive information began to surface in courtrooms and investigations. Luciano's network of influence, which had relied on discretion, intimidation and loyalty, was being tested by transparency and exposure. These events forced him into a reactive posture, requiring interventions, negotiations and calculated concessions to maintain control. It was a psychological shift from proactive strategy to damage control, a transition that even a mind as brilliant as Luciano's could not navigate without cost. Betrayal. Ever the shadow in Luciano's world began to emerge more visibly. Allies who had once been reliable turned opportunistic, influenced by fear, greed or pressure from law enforcement. Information once carefully contained began to leak. Each disclosure, each act of disloyalty chipped away at the perception of invulnerability that had been central to his authority, the very psychological mechanisms that had reinforced his power. Fear, respect and charisma were now under strain. Allies and rivals alike were testing boundaries, probing for weakness and positioning themselves in anticipation of what they sensed as an inevitable decline. Yet true to form, Luciano did not succumb to panic. Even as the pressures mounted, he applied the same intelligence, foresight and psychological insight that had defined his rise. Strategic decisions were made to mitigate exposure, sensitive operations were restructured, alliances were recalibrated and attempts were made to influence investigations subtly. He understood that survival required adaptation and that the perception of control could be as powerful as control itself. Yet despite these efforts, the convergence of law enforcement attention, internal friction and the inherent fragility of his empire created conditions in which his fall had begun, a fall that was as much psychological as it was operational. The psychological impact of these events was profound. A man who had once been nearly untouchable now confronted forces that could neither be predicted nor entirely controlled. Fear, once a tool, became a latent vulnerability. Perception, once a weapon, now required careful management. The constant negotiation of loyalty, strategy and reputation consumed mental and emotional energy, revealing the human limitations beneath the persona of invincibility. Even the most brilliant minds are susceptible to the pressures of exposure, betrayal and systemic instability, and Luciano was now acutely aware of these vulnerabilities. By the end of this period, the fall of Lucky Luciano had quietly begun. It was not marked by a single dramatic moment but by the slow accumulation of pressures: law enforcement scrutiny, rival ambition, minor betrayals, and the logistical challenges of maintaining a sprawling criminal empire. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together they created a convergence that began to undermine the stability of his reign. This was a critical lesson in power. No matter how sophisticated the strategy, how formidable the intelligence, or how meticulous the organization, external forces and human unpredictability can initiate decline, even in the most successful of figures. In retrospect, the fall of Luciano was as much about timing and circumstance as it was about personal failure. The very systems he had built, networks of influence, coordinated operations and psychological leverage, were now vulnerable to the pressures of exposure, rivalry and the inexorable reach of law. His response, a mixture of strategic adaptation, calculated negotiation and ruthless enforcement, delayed the inevitable, but it could not entirely prevent the erosion of control. The initial stage of his downfall serves as a study in the fragility of power, the complexity of human loyalty and the inevitability of consequences in a world defined by ambition, risk and unpredictability. By examining this phase of Luciano's life, one gains insight not only into the mechanics of organized crime but also into the human psychology of power and vulnerability. The fall begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the intersection of external pressures and internal dynamics. For Lucky Luciano, it was a period in which the very skills that had elevated him, strategic brilliance, psychological insight and organizational genius, were tested against forces beyond his absolute control. It was the first step in a narrative that would see the man who had remade organized crime confront the limits of his own empire and the enduring tension between ambition and mortality. The fall of Lucky Luciano reached a critical turning point in the courtroom, a stage far removed from the streets, speakeasies and hidden offices where he had mastered control, influence and strategy. For a man accustomed to orchestrating events from the shadows, the public glare of legal scrutiny was both alien and unforgiving. His arrest had already sent ripples through the underworld. Now the trial would expose him to an entirely different form of power, the machinery of the state, law, procedure and the spectacle of justice operated according to rules he could not bend, manipulate or fully control. In this theater, charisma and cunning could only do so much, and every word, gesture and expression carried immense weight. The charges against Luciano were both specific and symbolic. He faced accusations of running a prostitution ring, a charge that highlighted the moral and legal boundaries of the era while symbolizing the broader threat his organized operations posed to society. For the public and The media. The trial was not merely a matter of criminal procedure, it was a spectacle, a window into the secret world of power, corruption and violence that had long operated beneath the city's surface. Newspapers amplified every detail, sensationalized every allegation and framed Luciano as both a mastermind and a moral villain. For him this was a psychological battlefield. Perception was now as important as the legal arguments themselves. Inside the courtroom the dynamics were tense and multifaceted. Prosecutors sought not just conviction but symbolic victory, a demonstration that even the most powerful figures were not above the law. Witnesses were carefully orchestrated, evidence meticulously presented, and the media spotlight cast every gesture and expression under scrutiny. Luciano for his part faced a dual challenge, defending himself against tangible legal threats while managing the intangible power of reputation, narrative and perception. The trial became a psychological crucible, testing the very faculties that had made him a master of the streets and the underworld. Psychologically, this period was intensely destabilizing for a man accustomed to control. The courtroom represented unpredictability. Judges, juries, witnesses and prosecutors operated outside the networks he had mastered. Alliances that had served him in the underworld held no sway here. The mechanisms of influence he had carefully cultivated, fear, respect, loyalty, were largely ineffective in a system governed by law and public scrutiny. This forced a confrontation with limits, a recognition that even brilliance, charisma and ruthlessness could not always override institutional power or the collective judgment of society. The trial was also a theater of strategy. Luciano's defense team meticulously crafted arguments to challenge evidence, discredit witnesses and cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Every motion, objection and line of questioning was a move in a complex psychological game where perception mattered as much as facts. Yet despite careful planning the stakes remained high. One misstep, a poorly chosen word, a misinterpreted reaction or a lapse in composure could tip the balance, influencing jurors, shaping media coverage and altering the trajectory of the case. The pressure of this environment was unlike anything Luciano had faced before, demanding adaptation, patience and resilience. Media frenzy intensified the psychological stakes. Newspapers and radio broadcasts sensationalized every detail, painting Luciano as a figure both fascinating and dangerous. Headlines emphasized his audacity, his charisma and his criminal empire, creating a public persona that was larger than life. This media spectacle added another layer of complexity to the trial. Public perception was now an active force, influencing jurors, shaping law enforcement approaches and amplifying pressure on all parties involved. Luciano had to navigate not only legal arguments but the broader narrative, aware that every action or statement could be interpreted through the lens of public fascination and moral outrage. The moral dimension of the trial also weighed heavily for many. Luciano embodied the dangers of unbridled ambition, cunning and ruthlessness. For others he represented ingenuity, resilience and the capacity to rise above circumstance. This duality heightened the psychological stakes. He was simultaneously a criminal mastermind, a figure of fear and a subject of admiration in the courtroom. These competing perceptions collided, creating a complex psychological environment in which every gesture, tone and strategic choice carried amplified significance. The trial was not merely a question of guilt or innocence, it was a negotiation of reputation, power and legacy. Under public scrutiny, defense strategies relied heavily on technicalities, witness credibility and the absence of direct evidence linking Luciano to criminal operations. The psychological art was in balancing aggression with composure, demonstrating confidence and capability while avoiding arrogance or provocation. Every interaction with the prosecution was carefully calibrated, every appearance before the jury strategically staged to convey competence and authority. In this sense, the courtroom became another battlefield, one in which Luciano applied the same principles of observation, strategy and psychological insight that had guided his rise, but against forces he could not fully control. Despite these efforts, the trial's outcome reflected both the strengths and limitations of his influence. Evidence, witness testimony and the weight of the legal system created circumstances that even Luciano's brilliance could not entirely overcome. Conviction, though partially anticipated, underscored a profound reality: the very mechanisms of power that had elevated him in the underworld. Fear, loyalty, strategic alliances had limited effect when confronted with institutional authority and collective judgment. This was a defining moment, not merely in terms of legal consequences but in psychological terms, a confrontation with limits, vulnerability and the consequences of a life lived at the extremes of ambition and influence. The sentence itself was both a personal and symbolic turning point. Imprisonment represented the first real containment of a figure who had operated with unprecedented autonomy and influence. For Luciano, it was a profound psychological shift, from orchestrator to observer, from master of networks to subject of confinement. Yet even in this constrained environment he demonstrated resilience, adaptability and a continued application of strategic thinking. The courtroom had curtailed his freedom, but it could not immediately erase the influence he had embedded across an empire built over decades. In retrospect, the trial and sentence illustrate the intersection of law psychology and power. Luciano's genius had been in anticipating human behavior, structuring influence, and navigating complexity, but the courtroom operated according to a different set of rules where public perception, legal procedure, and collective judgment constrained even the most capable mind. This episode underscores the fragility inherent in any empire built on human networks. Perception and influence. No matter how sophisticated the strategy, exposure to forces outside one's control can catalyze decline. Yet the trial also solidified aspects of Luciano's legacy: his composure under pressure, strategic engagement with legal and psychological dynamics, and understanding of perception allowed him to navigate this unprecedented challenge with a level of sophistication that few contemporaries could match. Even in defeat, his actions demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and adaptability, qualities that ensured his influence would endure beyond the courtroom, shaping the underworld and the perception of power for decades to come. Ultimately, the trial and sentence marked the formal beginning of a new chapter, a period in which the man who had remade organized crime would confront the limits of control, the consequences of exposure, and the challenges of legacy. It was a moment of both downfall and enduring influence, a reminder that even the most brilliant architects of power are subject to forces beyond their mastery, and that the interplay of law, perception, and human psychology can alter the course of even the most formidable life. Imprisonment might have been designed to neutralize Lucky Luciano, to strip him of influence and visibility, yet behind the walls of his cell a different kind of power emerged, one that was subtler, psychological, and no less formidable. Even confined, Luciano retained control over networks, operations, and the flow of information. He had always understood that power was not simply about physical presence, it was about perception, influence, and the orchestration of human behavior. Prison became another environment in which he could apply these principles, transforming apparent limitations into opportunities to reinforce authority and maintain his empire from a distance. Luciano's reputation preceded him behind bars, and it served as a currency of influence. Fellow inmates, guards, and administrators alike were aware of his past achievements, his intellect, and his capacity for strategy. Fear and respect intertwined in subtle ways. Those who might have challenged him recognized the danger of doing so, and those who sought alliance saw the advantage in proximity. In this environment, he exercised psychological influence rather than brute force, using perception, negotiation, and subtle manipulation to maintain authority. Without the freedom of the streets, even in confinement, Luciano's presence was felt. His empire remained operational because people believed it could and should be. Communication networks, though restricted, became crucial tools for power. Behind bars, messages were passed discreetly through trusted intermediaries, often in coded language or subtle signals. Luciano ensured that key decisions, operational directives, and strategic guidance continued to flow from him to loyal associates. His understanding of loyalty, cultivated over years of experience, was instrumental. Associates were motivated not just by profit but by the implicit understanding that alignment with him ensured survival, stability, and advantage. Even in prison, Luciano's influence was reinforced by the same psychological levers he had always used: fear, respect, and perception. The art of negotiation also became central to his survival and continued influence. Luciano interacted with prison officials, fellow inmates, and external actors with a calculated balance of deference and assertiveness. He understood which concessions were necessary, which alliances could be leveraged, and which gestures would enhance perception of power. Every interaction was measured, every decision analyzed for potential impact on his broader network. This strategic approach extended the reach of his authority beyond the physical confines of prison, reinforcing the notion that his empire was resilient, adaptive, and guided by a mind capable of long-term calculation. Luciano also recognized the importance of public perception. Even while behind bars, media coverage of his imprisonment was extensive, portraying him as both criminal mastermind and cultural phenomenon. He leveraged this attention, subtly reinforcing his aura of influence while signaling to associates, rivals, and law enforcement alike that he remained a central figure in organized crime. The duality of fear and fascination continued to work in his favor. The public narrative amplified his psychological influence, extending his authority beyond the physical boundaries of the prison walls. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's ability to exercise power behind bars reflected his mastery of human psychology. He understood that individuals respond to perception, expectation, and the projection of authority as much as to direct action. Even when stripped of freedom, he cultivated an image of omnipresence and control. Associates, aware of his strategic mind and capacity for foresight, continued to execute operations in alignment with his vision. Rivals, cautious of potential retaliation or disruption, often deferred to his influence even without direct instruction. In this way, Luciano's control was both structural and psychological, embedded in the loyalty of his network. The fear of opposition and the perception of enduring authority. The broader implication of this period was profound. Luciano demonstrated that power is not solely contingent on mobility or immediate enforcement, it is rooted in the system's perceptions and human dynamics. One cultivates his continued influence during imprisonment underscored a fundamental principle: authority that is psychological, institutionalized and networked can persist even under conditions of extreme constraint. This was a lesson not only for organized crime but for the study of leadership strategy and human behavior more broadly. The period also illuminated the fragility and adaptability of his empire. While Luciano remained a central figure, operational efficiency depended on loyal intermediaries and trusted channels of communication. Mistakes, disloyalty, or misinterpretation could have had cascading consequences, yet the systems he had designed, combined with his psychological insight into human behavior, allowed the empire to function with surprising resilience. Even confinement, intended as punishment and limitation, became a stage upon which his influence continued to manifest. Luciano's time in prison also allowed him to reflect strategically on the broader trajectory of his operations and life. Removed from daily pressures, he could analyze the structures he had created, evaluate vulnerabilities, and plan contingencies for the future. This period of enforced distance reinforced a key aspect of his genius: the ability to combine tactical observation with long-term vision. While the fall from street-level omnipotence was undeniably real, the exercise of power behind bars demonstrated that influence could be more enduring than physical presence, more resilient than immediate enforcement, and more subtle than direct control. Psychologically, this chapter of Luciano's life revealed the adaptability of a mind conditioned for power. He had cultivated resilience, patience, and strategic foresight to a degree that allowed him to maintain authority even when physically constrained. The lessons learned from years of street battles, alliances, betrayals, and institutional maneuvering were now applied within the unique social ecosystem of prison. Every interaction, every observation, and every decision was infused with strategic purpose. Luciano's genius lay not only in what he controlled but in how he framed perception, guided behavior, and projected influence beyond direct reach. In essence, power behind bars illustrates a rare phenomenon: a man whose authority was rooted as much in psychological perception, loyalty, and networks as in tangible assets or mobility. Luciano's ability to maintain influence while imprisoned reflects the sophistication of his strategic mind, the depth of his understanding of human behavior, and the resilience of the systems he had created. Even as law, confinement, and circumstance sought to constrain him, his empire continued to operate, guided by the principles of control, perception, and calculated influence that had always defined his approach. By the end of this period, Luciano had demonstrated that true power is multidimensional. It is not merely physical, transactional, or immediate. It is relational, psychological, and systemic. Prison, intended as a place of punishment, became another environment in which his influence could be projected, tested, and maintained. This chapter of his life underscores the enduring interplay between human psychology, strategic insight, and organizational resilience, revealing that even in apparent decline, a master of influence can extend authority far beyond conventional boundaries. After a decade behind bars, Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, a return that was both homecoming and exile. The streets of New York, the networks he had mastered, and the empire he built were now thousands of miles away. Italy, still recovering from the devastation of World War II, presented new challenges: unfamiliar politics, fragmented power structures, and the absence of the immediate authority he had once commanded. Exile forced him to confront a paradox: immense reputation and strategic genius, yet limited freedom to act directly. Despite distance, Luciano remained a central figure in organized crime. Through letters, emissaries, and coded messages, he directed operations and ensured loyalty, applying the same psychological insight and strategic foresight that had guided his rise. Relationships became instruments of influence, and perception became a subtle yet powerful tool. He adapted to the constraints, proving that true authority could transcend geography. Exile also brought reflection. Removed from immediate danger, Luciano analyzed his past, evaluated vulnerabilities, and contemplated legacy. He learned that influence is not just action but perception, and that systems of loyalty and fear could endure beyond physical presence. While his personal freedom was curtailed, his mind and vision remained active, shaping networks and guiding successors. In this final stage, he demonstrated resilience, strategic mastery, and the enduring application of psychological insight, showing that even in exile, power could persist through intellect, foresight, and influence. Luciano's legacy extends far beyond his criminal exploits. By creating the Commission, he transformed disorganized street gangs into a structured, negotiated system of power. Violence became regulated, disputes mediated, and loyalty formalized, turning fear and respect into instruments of influence. He institutionalized strategies that balanced ambition, negotiation, and human psychology, leaving a framework that outlasted him and shaped organized crime globally. His genius lay not only in operations but in Understanding people, he anticipated behavior, manipulated perception, and harnessed loyalty to maintain control. Even his enemies acknowledged his strategic brilliance while allies were bound by fear and calculated respect. Luciano's life also highlights the duality of myth and reality. Admired and feared, legendary yet human, brilliant yet vulnerable. Culturally, Luciano became a symbol and archetype of power, strategy, and charisma. His story influenced media, film, and literature, reinforcing the idea that perception can be as potent as action. Psychologically, his life offers lessons in leadership, organizational mastery, and resilience. He demonstrates that power is relational, systemic, and enduring when built on insight and strategic foresight. Luciano's legacy is a blueprint of influence, one that merges intellect, human understanding, and structural innovation, leaving an indelible imprint on both crime and the psychology of power itself. Lucky Luciano's life embodies the paradox of power, extraordinary influence alongside vulnerability, audacity tempered by consequence, and genius shadowed by exposure. From the chaos of early streets to the zenith of control and finally to exile, his journey is both a criminal biography and a study in human behavior, strategy, and perception. The arc of his life illustrates the dualities of every empire: creation and destruction, loyalty and betrayal, public image and private calculation. His structural innovations: the Commission codified loyalty and networked influence, redefined organized crime, and demonstrated the potency of perception, foresight, and systemic thinking. Yet his trials, imprisonment, and exile remind us that even the most brilliant empires are vulnerable to external pressures, human unpredictability, and circumstance. Luciano's story also highlights the interplay between myth and reality. The legend amplifies audacity and brilliance, while the human being reveals calculation, adaptation, and resilience. His psychological mastery over fear, loyalty, and perception was as powerful as any operation he orchestrated. Even in decline, he demonstrated strategic foresight, ensuring his influence persisted. Ultimately, Luciano's life and legacy offer timeless lessons. Power is relational and systemic. Influence extends beyond presence, and human psychology governs both control and vulnerability. He remains a figure of fascination, a cautionary tale, and a masterclass in strategy, perception, and leadership. The man who built empires, survived betrayal, and endured exile leaves a blueprint for understanding not only organized crime but the enduring dynamics of power itself.